speaker is Elena Schmidt from TU Delft. She will talk about, or I think that's more of a question here, interesting questions on one side that you presented. Please.
Yeah. Thanks for the introduction. Can people in the back also hear me? Perfect. Cool. So I know it's a bit of a clickbait question. Is airborne wind energy more acceptable than wind turbines? But you're all here, so I think it worked. So I'm going to try and provide a bit of a cautionary answer to that question by presenting some first results that we got with, through a community survey. And those of you who were at the Airborne Wind Energy Conference in Milan last year, you already saw some of my preliminary findings, and those are now the full results. But they're still unpublished, so don't share them too widely. So studies in Europe as well as the US have found strong support for renewables, including wind turbines, both at a general level as well as when it comes to local projects. Nonetheless, there's often a very small group of people who oppose local wind developments, and they're commonly concerned about impacts of these projects on residents as well as nature. Now, it's often claimed that airborne wind energy will address some of these concerns. And I had a very close look at the literature to find out what the industry or the field, also researchers, actually claiming. So what we found through our comprehensive literature review is that there are generally 4 major claims. The first one being that airborne wind energy is less visible than wind turbines because it operates at a higher altitude, because it doesn't have a tower, and it also doesn't really produce a substantial shadow. Secondly, it's often claimed that airborne wind energy is quieter than wind turbines. Thirdly, it's claimed that it is less ecologically damaging because it would produce fewer bird and bat strikes. Now, only public safety concerns and also certain sites, for example, placing airborne wind energy in densely populated regions, was recognized as potential bottlenecks to acceptance by the literature. Well, first of all, while there's actually still a lot of data missing on the true impacts, such as noise impacts, environmental impacts, and also visual impacts, even if these impacts were objectively speaking low, it doesn't mean that people will also perceive them as such, because subjective perception plays a major role in how people assess technologies. They don't assess technologies in an entirely neutral, objective fashion. This means that if the literature keeps making these claims and cannot actually back them up with data, and these claims turn out to be wrong, it could lead to misinformed policies and deployment practices, which could increase the burden of the technology on people, and thereby also hamper support for the technology in the long term, which could then ultimately reduce the sector's contribution to renewable energy targets. So how do we get out of this pickle? Well, what we need at this point is social science studies that can help us better understand how people really perceive the technology and how they respond to it. And that's what we attempted to do when we conducted a community survey around an airborne wind energy test site in the north of Germany. And we chose the specific test site because it has the longest operation hours, according to the developer, SkyCells Power. And another benefit of the site is that there are a lot of wind farms in the vicinity, so that allowed us to compare residents' answers for the airborne wind energy system and the closest wind park. How did we get people to participate? Well, basically anybody living within a 5-kilometer radius around the test site was welcome to participate, and we made them aware of the study by reaching out through various recruitment channels that you can also see here. And in the end, we had 54 participants, and the sample is relatively representative of the local population. And the method that we used were structured in-person interviews, meaning that we had developed a questionnaire, and then we took physical copies. I know it sounds very old-fashioned, but we took physical copies of the questionnaire, went to people's homes, sat down with them for around an hour, and guided them through the questionnaire, recording their answers. The reason we did it this way and not online is that it usually improves the reliability of the answers because you have the personal connection with the participant. So the questionnaire was designed based on this recently published integrated acceptance model. And according to this model, there are 5 main factors which adequately predict the acceptance of the local renewable energy project. So just briefly, according to this model, acceptance tends to be higher when residents perceive more positive impacts of the local project on the local economy, when they have a more positive attitude towards the energy transition in general, when they perceive the planning process of the local project more positively, when they perceive fewer negative impacts of the project on nature and residents, and finally, when they appraise the social norms around the project more positively. Now, what does that mean? So, according to this model, acceptance tends to be higher when residents think that other community members are also accepting of the project. As I said before, common concerns regarding renewable energy projects revolve around impacts on residents, but also the planning process plays a major role, and research has shown that over and over again. So I'm going to present our findings for those 2 factors. So first of all, regarding impacts on residents, especially visual impacts, we found that the visual impacts of the Avalon wind energy system were rated on average slightly better than for the closest wind park. Specifically, the landscape impact was rated more positively for the Avalon wind energy system, and people tended to be more annoyed by shadows and obstruction lights of the closest wind park than the Avalon wind energy system. In fact, of the people that we interviewed, not a single person could even perceive a shadow of the Avalon wind energy system on their property, meaning that they also couldn't be annoyed by it. Only regarding landscape fit, so how well the infrastructures fit into the local landscape, we couldn't really find a significant difference between the Avalon wind energy system and the wind farm. So moving on, with regards to noise impacts, obviously noise emissions can also be quite impacting for local residents. We found that the wind park was heard more often than the Avalon wind energy system, but among those people who could hear the Avalon wind energy system on their property, an equal or like a comparable percentage was annoyed by it as for the wind park, and also the intensity of annoyance was relatively comparable across the wind park and the Avalon wind energy system. Now, I want to stress here that these findings are not generalizable at this stage, because they're obviously limited to one prototype, and I think as most of you know, there's a huge diversity in prototypes, which will also lead to do different impacts on residents. Plus, Sky6 Power hasn't really optimized their prototype yet and tried to mitigate any of the impacts, whereas the wind park that people refer to, those are obviously modern wind turbines, so they have been optimized for noise emissions, etc. Secondly, people have been less exposed to the Avalon wind energy system because it doesn't operate daily, first of all, whereas the wind farm is always there and operates most of the time. And they also live significantly further from the Avalon wind energy system than from the wind park. Plus, the majority of people could only see the system when it was in operation and the kite was clearly visible in the sky. And then finally, even though we asked people to only refer to the closest wind park, there is a great number of wind parks in the vicinity, so there might also have been a cumulative impact of those when it comes to, for example, annoyance by obstruction lights, because you obviously also see blinking lights of other wind parks in the distance. So that's important to keep in mind when looking at our results. Now, while there are some obvious technological differences between Avalon wind energy and wind turbines, which might also lead to differences in impacts, it's really important to keep in mind that it's not just the technology that matters, it's also how it is deployed. And that we also saw reflected in our data, because we saw that residents who perceived fewer impacts of the Avalon wind energy system tended to have higher acceptance of the system. So developers should really try to avoid impacts then mitigate them, and only as a last resort compensate for them. And always in agreement with the local community, because they can best say what their needs are. Furthermore, we also saw that when residents perceived the whole process of setting up the Airborne Wind Energy System and operating it more positively, they also tended to be more accepting of the site. So again, the recommendation for developers would be to take residents seriously by consulting them, and where possible also engaging them in setting up a project. Now the difference between informing, consulting, and engaging is that when you inform somebody, you're just providing information about your plans. When you're consulting them, you're also asking for feedback, asking what do you think, and maybe you will consider the feedback. And when you're engaging people, you're really including them in the project, and you're also giving them an opportunity to help shape the project to a certain extent. So what I want to stress here is that community engagement should not just be seen as a tool to overcome opposition, but it should be done in a meaningful way, because it can actually help to improve projects and thereby also help build support for technology in the long term. Now, I presented some comparisons of the Airborne Wind Energy System and the wind park and some isolated correlations, but what would be really interesting to know is which of these main factors drives acceptance or predicts acceptance most strongly, because once we know that, we also know maybe where some weaknesses lie and where we have to kind of tackle things. And so we are applying this regression model to our data at the moment. We're writing up the results, and once it's published, I invite you all to read the results if you're interested. So if you want to connect with me this way, you're welcome to follow my work. Thank you.
Are there any questions or developers we should address?
Okay, 2 quick questions. You sent out more than 1,000 invites and had 54 participants, so that's not a very high rate. Do you have any data on why so few people out of the invited choose to participate? First question. Second, you had that image there, and it's clear that one AMIS device cannot generate as much power as all the wind farm below. So you need a whole swarm of that in order to generate the same power as the wind farm you want to replace. Have you looked into that? Because a whole swarm of them will make a different impression in just one.
Yeah, definitely. So regarding your first question, unfortunately in the social sciences, these response rates are usually quite low because it is time consuming. So it took us an hour to do this interview, sometimes 90 minutes, and not everybody, has this kind of time. So it's quite normal, I have to say. And I think another reason why people maybe didn't feel inclined to participate, because we also reached out via phone and we asked like, oh, are you sure you don't want to participate? And they said, well, I don't really know that much about the technology. I don't know what to tell you. So I think it's also that a lot of people, were not familiar with it, so they didn't feel, like they could actually say something about it. Second question, yeah, it's a very good point. I do think it will make a difference whether you have one system or a whole farm, and this is what further research needs to investigate. The reason we focused on one is that right now there's simply just one system in operation. And I mean, you could do like hypothetical studies where you give different scenarios, but we are really interested in residents' experiences, and that's why we focused on one system. But, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm a little bit surprised about the results about the noise, because it's similar, the annoyance field to wind turbines. I would expect that it will be less.
Yeah, so this is also what we saw through the literature review, right? That the field commonly thinks that it will be quieter than wind turbines. But as I also said when I went through the limitations, so this single system, not this one, but the one we looked at, hasn't been optimized yet for noise emissions, whereas wind turbines obviously have. So I've been also talking to developers, and they still see a lot of wiggle room to reduce emissions, but my message to them is start looking into it now. because you're already rolling these test sites out. So you're already engaging with communities. So, you know, the first impression counts. So, yeah.
Maybe to add to this, we now have a graduation project at TU Delft where we look at noise. We have data from kite mill and from kite power, fixed wing and a soft wing system, and we measure the ground footprint with a high quality microphone and go through the whole aeroacoustic analysis, and that data will become available, and it actually reflects this. There is still a lot of room for improvement, fluttering of the wing, all these mechanisms. A commercial product will later not have that anymore, or much less. Developers focus on getting this thing flying, produce a sufficient number of details. Just
Hi, yeah, thanks very much. So it might have been on the slides and I missed it. What was the average age of the participants in the study? And do you think, for instance, like airborne wind being something new and cool and something might have sort of flowed into it, whereas like, yeah, conventional wind maybe old or something that would be perceived differently?
Yeah, so the average age was 61, which is rather high, but the local population also tends to be more on the, like, a bit older. That is a good point. So I was now presenting only our quantitative results, but we also asked them open-ended questions. So we got text-based data, which we then analyzed in a structured way. And there you could really see that there were two groups of people. The group of people who thought like, oh, this is such a great innovation and it's good that we're exploring alternatives, not just to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, but also to see if there may be you know, additions to the renewables we already have. And then there was a group of people who said like, oh, this is nonsense. Someone even said like, oh, this is just play, adults playing with a big toy kite. Because, yeah, seriously, because they think, oh, this is never going to materialize, and the energy output is way too low, and it's never gonna happen. And you could also see that the first group of people tended to have a more positive attitude, and the second group of people a more negative attitude. But then it's questionable, like what was their first, right? So, yeah.
Can you say your name and affiliation?
Yeah. So, Merat Kazemian from Strasbourg. So the question is that, for instance, first, what's the target area for airborne wind? Is airborne wind going to compete with, for instance, traditional or conventional wind energy in the areas, for instance, and the demography of the people you asked the question? For instance, in Scotland, we have got a lot of islands and islands. Probably airborne wind is a very good choice for more remote areas. When they're remote areas, people are more sensitive to the nature, changes to nature. So I'm not, just wanted to know where the people come from in your survey.
Okay, so where the test site, it's like a rural area. So generally an older population, but they're quite familiar with renewables because they started building wind parks there in the 90s already. But there were mainly community-driven projects, so a high degree of community ownership. So that often is then interlinked with a more positive attitude to renewables. And you can also see that they were, you know, on average very accepting of conventional wind energy there as well. But I do agree that there's always situational or like context-specific differences. But this 5-factor model that I showed has also been applied across regions, across sites. So it's generally a good framework. So yeah.
I mean, it could be not just on the negative side. It could be on the positive side.
Right, yeah.
If, for instance, airborne wind goes to some islands in Scotland where maintenance of the conventional wind is very difficult, then it will boost the energy, the economy of that region, that remote island. Then they might be more welcoming.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Especially, like, what we also heard a lot is that people were saying, we were asking, okay, under which conditions would you agree with this technology being commercialized here? And they said, well, we want to benefit from it as well. So not just through, you know, co-ownership, but also that we can actually use the electricity locally. And that was quite important to them because right now a lot of electricity is produced in the north of Germany, but it's being sent throughout the whole country. And they feel like, oh, we're just the producers, we're not actually the consumers of our own electricity. So in that sense, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it would be interesting to do a case study once there is like a fully operational system somewhere on an island, yeah.
Actually, you see it here. This was on Aruba. Aruba is a Caribbean island.
But it was just temporary, so we
Temporary,
couldn't,
yes.
yeah.
I think we have one last question, and then we really need to move on.
I actually didn't want to ask a question. I just wanted to say maybe you repeat what you said during the work package 2 meeting, because I think we have some more people that weren't there. I think it's very valuable to advertise once more what you said during the work package meeting.
Yeah. So we have an IEA task just dedicated to airborne wind energy, and within that task we obviously have a lot of different technical work packages, but there's also a work package on social acceptance. So if you're working on airborne wind energy, maybe more on the technical or economic side, or you're thinking about it, please also consider reaching out to your colleagues within your institutions who are more on the social side, because we could really need more manpower and woman power on this line of research, because right now I'm the only one who's doing this full time, so it would be good to have more research, as was also pointed out on islands, for example. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much.